Walter Chrysler entered the world in the kind of place America was still inventing. Kansas, late 19th century. Flat land, big sky, wind that never seemed to meet an obstacle worth respecting. Towns were small, practical, and temporary looking, as if they might fold up and move if the rail line shifted. For most families, life was measured in seasons and harvests. For Chrysler's family, life was measured in timetables. His father worked the railroad, not as a distant symbol of industry, but as a real man with grease under his nails and long hours in his bones. Locomotives weren't romantic in that world. They were loud, heavy, dangerous, and essential. They brought supplies, took away goods, carried news, carried strangers, carried the future. The railroad yard wasn't just part town life. It was town life. As a boy, Walter absorbed that environment the way other kids absorb bedtime stories. The sound of metal striking metal, the hiss of steam, the smell of coal smoke and hot oil, the way a machine could look dead and still be alive, quiet, waiting, holding power inside it. But what stayed with him most wasn't the spectacle. It was a logic. The railroad was order. It was systems. It was cause and effect. A bolt loosened in one place could become a disaster 3 miles later. A valve set slightly wrong could turn efficiency into waste. A rush repair could cost a day, or cost a man. In that world, you learned one rule early. Machines don't care what you meant to do. They only care what you did. Walter's father wanted a different future for him. A safer one. A more respectable one. College. A clean shirt. Work that didn't involve crawling under engines or lifting steel with your back and hope. That was the dream many parents carried for their children. Step away from the smoke and noise into something calmer. But Walter's mind was already turning in a direction that school couldn't match. In classrooms, knowledge came in tidy pieces. Facts, dates, spelling lists. In the rail yard, knowledge came as a problem that had to be solved before the whistle blew again. The yard didn't reward memorization. It rewarded understanding. And Walter wanted to understand. At 15, he left school. Not dramatically. Not with manifesto. Just a choice made with the certainty of someone who can't tolerate detours. He found work immediately. Hard work. Long work. The kind that didn't ask what you dreamed about, only whether you could show up tomorrow. He delivered groceries for 16 hours a day for $10 a month. It was exhaustion disguised as employment. The kind of job that teaches you how long a day can really be. The kind of job that makes you realize what time is worth when you're trading it by the hour. But even then, his real ambition wasn't money. It was proximity to machines, to mechanisms, to the hidden intelligence inside things that moved. His father resisted when Walter pushed toward the railroad shops. That wasn't stubbornness. It was fear dressed up as caution. Shops were dangerous. Men lost fingers. Boilers exploded. Steel slipped. One mistake could end a life, and it didn't matter if you were careful most of the time. It only mattered if you were careless once. Walter listened, then kept pushing. He talked his way into an apprenticeship. 17 years old, 10 cents an hour. The pay was barely a statement. It wasn't meant to make you comfortable. It was meant to make you grateful you were allowed inside. But Walter didn't see it as inside. He saw it as where the real world was happening. In the shops, he learned quickly that there were two kinds of workers. Some did what they were told and went home. Others watched the whole system. They didn't just fix what broke. They tried to understand why it broke and how to keep it from breaking again. Walter became the second type. He developed a reputation for noticing details other people missed. A faint change in sound. A subtle irregularity in motion. A vibration that didn't belong. He wasn't guessing. He was reading the machine like a language. Valve timing became his specialty. Precise, unforgiving work. Engines could run with many flaws and still move, but valve settings punish you for arrogance. Get it wrong and you didn't just lose performance. You risked failure. Get it right, and the whole machine felt like it was cooperating with you, like it wanted to run. And that feeling, the moment when a system clicks into harmony because you understood it, hooked him deeper than any classroom ever could. For years, he moved through the American West chasing better roles, bigger responsibilities, new challenges. Colorado, Wyoming, Texas, Iowa. He wasn't drifting. He was leveling up. Each new shop was a new set of problems. Each new promotion was proof that his kind of mind had value. Foreman, superintendent, master mechanic. These weren't titles handed out as rewards. They were trust. The work demanded judgment. It demanded that you think in sequences. If we change this, what happens next? If we cut this corner, where does it reappear later as a bigger problem? Walter learned to see production like a map. Inputs, outputs, bottlenecks, waste, flow. He also learned something more subtle. Leadership in industrial work isn't about inspiring speeches. It's about building systems that make people safer and faster without grinding them into dust. By the time he reached his early 30s, he'd achieved what most railroad men would call the top. He had a strong salary, authority, and respect. He had won the world he'd chosen. And yet, this is the part that matters. He still wasn't satisfied. Because even though locomotives were powerful, they were also finished. Mature technology, established methods, old giants. Then in 1908, he attended the Chicago Auto Show. He walked into a hall full of strange, noisy, half-wild machines, cars that looked like they were barely tamed. They weren't standardized yet. They weren't inevitable yet. The industry didn't have rules written in stone. It was still improvising. And in the middle of that hall, he saw one vehicle that caught him hard. A cream-colored car with a price tag, so high it almost felt insulting. $5,000. It was more than half his annual salary. The sensible choice would have been to admire it and move on. Walter bought it. He put down what he could and borrowed the rest. It was a kind of decision that looks reckless in a ledger and looks inevitable in hindsight. Then he did something even stranger. He didn't learn to drive it. He didn't parade it around town or show it off like a trophy. He had it shipped home, pushed into a barn and disassembled, not casually, not just the surface parts. He took it apart like it was a puzzle that had personally challenged him. He examined the engine, the transmission, the brakes, every connection, every gear, every surface shaped for a reason. Then he rebuilt it, and then he took it apart again, over and over, until the car stopped being a car and became what it truly was to him, a system. He wasn't collecting luxury. He was collecting understanding. That was the first real sign of what Walter Chrysler was going to become. Not simply a man who worked with machines, but a man who believed that mastery meant intimacy, that if you wanted to control the future, you had to know how it was assembled. And somewhere in that barn, with bolts arranged on the floor and grease on his hands, the railroad mechanic from Kansas began quietly stepping away from the rails. He didn't know the skyline yet. He didn't know Manhattan. He didn't know he would one day finance a tower that looked like a blade of light. But he already had the hunger that would make it possible. Because once you've tasted what it feels like to understand a machine completely, you stop wanting ordinary success. You start wanting something that can't be ignored by the time Walter Chrysler reached his mid-30s. He had done everything he was supposed to do. He had mastered his trade. He had earned promotions. He had secured a salary most men in the railroad industry never touched, $8,000 a year, then $12,000. In early 20th century America, that meant stability. It meant a good home, savings, respect. It meant you could stop climbing and simply live. Walter Chrysler did not stop. The automobile he had taken apart in his barn had changed the way he looked at the world. Locomotives were magnificent, but they were centralized. Railroads belonged to companies and governments. Cars, on the other hand, were personal. They were intimate machines. One driver, one engine, one road. They represented freedom and chaos. No one had fully figured them out yet. Factories struggled with consistency. Parts didn't always fit. Engines varied from batch to batch. Production was still closer to craft and science. To Chrysler, that just sort of looked like opportunity. In 1911, a banker contacted him with an unusual question. Would he consider working in automobiles? The question wasn't casual. Bankers noticed patterns. They noticed which managers improved operations, which factories ran smoothly, which supervisors solved problems instead of hiding them. Chrysler's reputation had traveled. He met executives at Buick. He spoke with Charles Nash. They wanted someone who understood machines from the inside out, not someone who learned management in classrooms, but someone who had rebuilt engines with his own hands. The offer came quickly, $6,000 a year. It was half of what he was making. Most people negotiate. Chrysler accepted immediately. To outsiders, it looked irrational. Why abandon security for uncertainty? Why move from a dominant industry into one that might collapse tomorrow? But Chrysler didn't think in terms of safety. He thought in terms of growth. The railroad industry was stable, which meant it was slow. The automobile industry was unstable, which meant it was alive. When he arrived in Flint, Michigan, he entered a different universe. The pace was faster. The mistakes were bigger. The stakes were higher. Factories ran hot, loud, and disorganized. Managers fought over budgets. Engineers argued over designs. Production lines stopped without warning. It was chaos, and Chrysler loved it. He began by watching, not issuing orders, not making speeches. Watching, he walked the factory floor. He followed parts from arrival to assembly. He timed processes. He asked workers why things took as long as they did. He noticed when materials piled up, where tools disappeared, where men waited for instructions. Most executives lived offices. Chrysler lived in systems. Within months, patterns emerged. Too many suppliers. Too much rework. Too little standardization. Too many decisions made emotionally instead of analytically. He reorganized production like he had reorganized railroad shops. Standard parts. Clear workflows. Precise scheduling. Accountability. Waste was his enemy. Not because it offended him morally, but because it offended him intellectually. Waste meant someone had failed to understand the system. Results followed. Defect rates dropped. Output increased. Cost stabilized. Buick became profitable. Then it became dominant. Within 5 years, it was the most successful division inside General Motors. Chrysler's salary rose accordingly. He became one of the highest-paid executives in American industry. And then came William Durant. Durant was General Motors. Visionary, charismatic, reckless. He believed in growth at any cost. More factories, more brands, more debt, more expansion. If the company was moving fast, he considered it healthy. Chrysler disagreed. To him, uncontrolled growth was disguised collapse. Every inefficiency multiplied. Every bad decision echoed. A bloated system became fragile. Their conflict was philosophical. When Chrysler proposed outsourcing to save millions, Durant proposed building new plants. When Chrysler streamlined dealerships, Durant sold them for personal alliances. When Chrysler argued for stability, Durant argued for spectacle. For years, Chrysler endured it. He believed in the work. But eventually, he recognized the pattern. No matter how efficient he made Buick, Durant would destabilize it. By 1919, he was exhausted. Not physically, mentally. He told Alfred Sloan he was done. He wanted out. He wanted to sell his stock and leave. Durant bought it. $10 million. The number barely registered at first. A boy who had once earned 10 cents an hour now possessed a fortune large enough to reshape industries. He was 44. He could have retired permanently. Instead, he went to work again. Bankers controlling Willis Overland, a failing automaker, asked him to intervene. They offered him $1 million per year, an extraordinary salary, to save the company. Chrysler agreed, but he demanded authority. He knew that without control, efficiency was impossible. For 2 years, he stabilized Willis. He reduced losses. He improved operations. Then the owner refused to relinquish power. Chrysler walked. He did not tolerate structural dysfunction. Next came Maxwell Motor Company. It was worse. $32 million in debt. Thousands of unsold cars rusting in fields. Market share collapsing. Friends warned him away. They said it would ruin his reputation. Chrysler saw something else. Factories, dealers, workers, infrastructure. The bones were intact. The product was a problem. So he hired 3 engineers and gave them freedom. No politics. No interference. No shortcuts. They designed a modern six-cylinder car with hydraulic brakes and high compression, technology usually reserved for luxury vehicles. The Chrysler 6 debuted in 1924. It shocked the market. Advanced, reliable, affordable. It sold tens of thousands of units in its first year. Maxwell was reborn. In 1925, it became Chrysler Corporation. Walter Chrysler now owned an empire, but ownership did not change him. He still walked factory floors. He still questioned workflows. He still dismantled assumptions. To him, success was not an endpoint. It was proof that his way of thinking worked. And now, with wealth, power, and independence, he began thinking about something he had never possessed before. A symbol, not a company, not a balance sheet, not a product. Something permanent. Something that could not be sold, merged, or forgotten. Something that would stand long after factories closed. He began to look east, toward Manhattan. In the late 1920s, New York was growing upward faster than anyone could fully comprehend. Every year, buildings climbed higher. Every season, cranes appeared where rooftops had been. The skyline was no longer a static silhouette. It was a living diagram of ambition, constantly redrawn by steel and money. Height had become currency. To build tall was to declare power. To build taller was to announce dominance. Banks, insurance companies, newspapers, and corporations competed not only for customers, but for altitude. A tower was advertising that could not be ignored. It could be seen from miles away. It told the city who mattered. Walter Chrysler watched all of this from a distance. He had conquered manufacturing. He had mastered production. He had created a corporate empire. But in New York, success was measured differently. Factories could close. Brands could fade. But buildings, great buildings, entered memory. Chrysler wanted memory. At the intersection of Lexington Avenue and 42nd Street stood a strange absence. It was one of the busiest corners in Midtown. Grand Central Terminal pulsed nearby. Office workers poured through the streets every morning. Traffic clogged the avenues. Yet in the middle of it all lay a vacant lot. For years, nothing had risen there. The land belonged to Cooper Union, a private institution that leased rather than sold property. In 1922, a developer named William Reynolds had taken the lease and promised something extraordinary: the tallest building in the world. Reynolds was a showman. Years earlier, he had built Dreamland, a spectacular amusement park at Coney Island filled with towers, lagoons, and electric lights. It had drawn crowds by the hundreds of thousands, but it had also burned down in a single night, destroyed by fire. Reynolds carried that history with him. He knew how to imagine grandeur. He was less skilled at sustaining it. When he leased the Lexington Avenue plot, he hired architect William Van Allen, a young designer fascinated by European modernism and emerging Art Deco ideas. Together, they conceived a tower that would shimmer with metal and glass, crowned by a luminous dome. It was bold. It was expensive. It was risky. By 1928, Reynolds had permits, drawings, and partial foundations. Then he ran out of money. Investors hesitated. Cost ballooned. Credit tightened. The project stalled. Steel orders were delayed. Excavation slowed. Contractors waited without payment. The dream froze in place. For months, the site remained a scar in the city. Excavated earth, scattered materials, half-finished work. To most developers, it looked like a warning. To Chrysler, it looked like an opening. He had been studying Manhattan quietly. He understood something many businessmen missed. New York real estate was not about immediate returns. It was about position. Location determined destiny. And this location, next to Grand Central, in the heart of Midtown, was priceless. More importantly, the project already existed. It had legal approvals. It had an architect. It had momentum. All it lacked was a patron with deep pockets and long patience. Chrysler had both. In October 1928, he bought Reynolds' lease and plans. The price exceeded $2.5 million. Then, on the same day, he ordered demolition. What little had been built was torn down. The foundations were reworked. The designs were discarded. Reynolds Tower vanished before it was born. Chrysler was starting over, but he was not starting small. At first, he told himself the building was practical, an investment for his children, a stable source of rental income, a hedge against industrial volatility. Factories rust. Buildings collect rent. That was the logic he presented. It was only partly true. When Chrysler first saw Van Allen's model for the revised building, something shifted. The tower was elegant, balanced, impressive. It was not unforgettable. The lobby was narrow. The massing was conservative. The height was respectable, not dominant. Chrysler stared at it in silence. Then he began asking questions. Why does the entrance feel ordinary? Why does the building step back here? Why stop at this height? Van Allen realized, slowly, that he was no longer designing for a developer. He was designing for a man building a monument. Chrysler demanded changes. Wider lobby, more dramatic setbacks, greater height. Each revision increased costs. Chrysler approved him anyway. Unlike most developers, he refused to use corporate funds. He paid personally. Every dollar came from his own fortune. This was not a business expense. It was self-expression. He studied drawings obsessively. He requested models. He debated materials. He evaluated how light would strike surfaces at different hours. He was not pretending to be an architect. He was acting like an engineer confronting the largest machine of his life. To him, the building was a system: foundation, frame, skin, circulation, light. If any element failed, the whole structure failed. Van Allen responded by pushing further. He abandoned traditional styles. He embraced Art Deco geometry. Clean lines, metallic finishes, aerodynamic forms inspired by airplanes and automobiles. The building would not imitate Europe. It would celebrate modernity. Stainless steel, triangular windows, radiating arches. It would look fast, even when standing still. The height kept increasing, from 67 floors to over 70, from 800 feet to over 900. Each revision triggered new engineering problems: wind loads, elevator speeds, structural stresses. But Chrysler encouraged it. Publicity followed height. Height followed ambition. By late 1928, excavation began in earnest. Workers dug nearly 70 feet through Manhattan schist to reach bedrock. Millions of pounds of stone were removed. Trucks carried it away day and night. The foundations grew massive. Thick concrete mats and steel reinforcements designed to support unimaginable weight. Above ground, the city watched with curiosity. Another tower, people said. Another rich man's project. Few understood what was forming. Chrysler was no longer thinking about offices. He was thinking about permanence. He had spent his life mastering systems that produced things which wore out. Cars aged. Engines failed. Factories closed. This building would not. It would outlast product cycles. Outlast executives. Outlast headlines. It would remain when balance sheets were forgotten. By the winter of 1928, the site no longer looked empty. It looked dangerous. Cranes rose. Steel arrived. Concrete flowed. The city had given Chrysler a stage. He was preparing to perform. And soon, the real construction would begin. When construction truly began, it did not feel like the start of a building. It felt like the activation of a system. By the winter of 1928, the site at Lexington and 42nd Street had become a controlled environment. Schedules were fixed. Supply routes were mapped. Labor teams were assigned with military precision. Every movement of material had a purpose. Every delay had a cost. Walter Chrysler did not treat the project like real estate. He treated it like a factory. Only this factory would produce a single product: a skyscraper. Excavation crews finished their work by early 1929, revealing bedrock scarred and leveled by drills and explosives. On that foundation, engineers poured massive concrete footings reinforced with steel, hidden anchors that would carry hundreds of thousands of tons. Most passers-by never noticed them. They would never see the most important part of the building. That invisibility pleased Chrysler. He believed that real strength did not need decoration. In January 1929, The steel arrived. Trainloads of beams rolled into the city from Carnegie steel mills. Each piece had been fabricated to precise specifications. Holes were pre-drilled. Lengths were exact. There was no room for improvisation at this scale. The frame was a puzzle with 20,000 tons of pieces, and it had to be assembled vertically. Cranes began lifting columns and girders into place. Iron workers guided them by hand, balancing on narrow beams hundreds of feet above the street. Riveters followed, heating rivets until they glowed, then hammering them into permanent joints. The rhythm became constant. Lift, align, heat, rivet, repeat. Day after day, the structure rose so quickly that newspapers struggled to keep up. Reporters wrote weekly updates. 10 more stories completed. Frame now at 30 floors. Tower surpasses nearby buildings. By summer, it was impossible to ignore. A steel skeleton dominated Midtown. But speed alone was not the remarkable thing. It was coordination. Chrysler demanded that nothing wait. Bricks arrived exactly when steel reached their level. Window frames followed immediately. Elevator shafts were constructed simultaneously. Electricians, plumbers, and plasterers worked on different floors at the same time, like synchronized swimmers moving through separate lanes. Most skyscrapers were built in stages. This one was built in layers. The engineering firm coordinating logistics created timetables so precise that materials were sometimes delivered hours before installation. Storage space was minimal. The building itself became a vertical warehouse. Delays were treated like defects. Chrysler visited often. He walked through dust and noise in tailored suits. He spoke with foremen. He inspected scaffolding. He asked about accident reports. He noticed when production slowed. To workers, he did not appear distant. He appeared demanding, but predictable. If you met standards, he supported you. If you cut corners, he replaced you. Safety became part of that system. At the time, skyscraper construction was notoriously dangerous. Falls, crush injuries, and fires were common. Developers treated casualties as inevitable. Chrysler rejected that logic. He had seen what accidents did to factories. Morale collapsed, productivity dropped, lawsuits multiplied. He implemented measures most builders considered excessive: guardrails around platforms, netting under work areas, covered scaffolds, on-site medical staff. Workers received safety briefings. Equipment was inspected. Violations were punished. Some contractors complained. Chrysler ignored them. Efficiency and safety were not opposites in his mind. They were partners. The results were unprecedented. As the tower climbed past 40, 50, 60 stories, no fatalities occurred. Engineers who had predicted multiple deaths revised their estimates. Union leaders took notice. Other developers quietly copied the methods. The Chrysler building became a model, without advertising itself as one. By September 1929, the steel frame was complete. It had taken less than 9 months. From street to summit, a lattice of beams now defined the tower's shape. Setbacks stepped backward as it rose, creating a cascading form that would later define Art Deco skyscrapers. From a distance, it looked like frozen motion, but the building was still unfinished. It had no walls, no windows, no interior life. Now came enclosure. Bricklayers moved upward like a tide, sealing floors from the outside. Nearly 4 million bricks were laid by hand, forming a skin that bore no structural weight, but protected the steel within. Stainless steel panels were installed at higher levels, their reflective surfaces catching sunlight. Workers polished them even before completion. Van Allen insisted on perfection. Any scratch would be visible for decades. Inside, elevators were installed, 32 of them, some capable of traveling at unprecedented speeds. City regulations limited velocity, but Chrysler pushed engineers to find loopholes. They calibrated acceleration curves so elevators technically complied, while still moving faster than permitted. Inspectors protested. Paperwork prevailed. Electric systems were threaded through walls. Plumbing rose in vertical stacks. Heating systems were calibrated to function at heights where wind chilled surfaces far below street temperature. The building was becoming habitable. But something unusual was happening. Van Allen had modified part of the core. At the center of the tower ran a vertical fire shaft, normally used for stairs and utilities. Here, it was wider than necessary. It was reinforced. It was left partially empty. Few people questioned it. On a project as complex, anomalies were common. Only a small group understood its purpose. While the visible building approached completion, a second structure was forming inside it, hidden, unannounced, measured in secrecy. Chrysler knew nothing of the technical details, but he sensed something. He trusted Van Allen. He had given him freedom, and Van Allen was using it. By autumn 1929, the exterior walls were closing in. Scaffolding wrapped the crown. From the street, it appeared the building was nearly finished. Reporters wrote that the Chrysler building would soon top out at its announced height. Competitors relaxed. They believed the race was ending. But inside the tower spine, steel sections waited, numbered, assembled, tested, a weapon in an architectural war. While the city admired speed and scale, the true victory was being prepared in silence. The building was no longer just rising. It was planning its final move. Long before the Chrysler building began to dominate Midtown, its greatest threat had already been taking shape. Quietly, methodically, and with equal ambition, in Lower Manhattan, near Wall Street, another tower was rising. It stood on ground heavy with money and history. Banks, brokerage houses, and financial firms clustered around it like satellites around a star. This was the heart of American capitalism, and it demanded architecture that reflected its power. The building was commissioned by financier George Ostrom and designed by H. Craig Severance. Severance was not just another architect. He was William Van Allen's former partner. For 13 years, the two men had shared an office, a reputation, and success. Together, they had designed hotels, apartment buildings, and commercial towers that helped define New York's transition into a vertical city. Their partnership was built on contrast. Van Allen was imaginative, experimental, obsessed with form and symbolism. He cared about how buildings felt, how they moved the eye, how they spoke emotionally. Severance was pragmatic, disciplined, and client-focused. He cared about budgets, schedules, and satisfaction. He knew how to win contracts and keep investors confident. Together, they were formidable. Separately, they were incomplete. The break came in 1924. An architectural journal published a glowing review of one of their joint projects and credited Van Allen alone. Whether intentional or accidental, the omission humiliated Severance. He believed his role had been erased. Resentment hardened. Arguments followed. Lawsuits were filed. The partnership dissolved. What had once been collaboration became rivalry. For years, the two men avoided each other. Then Manhattan forced them back into the same arena. When Severance was hired to design a tower at 40 Wall Street, he recognized the opportunity instantly. This would not be just another office building. It would be a statement. It began modestly. 47 floors, then 60, then 62. Each revision pushed higher. By early 1929, Severance and Ostrom announced their goal, 840 feet. It would surpass the Woolworth Building. It would dominate the skyline. The announcement made headlines. Uptown, Van Allen read them carefully. Within weeks, he revised the Chrysler plans. New height, 925 feet. Reporters noticed. They framed it as a duel. The race into the sky. Newspapers called it. Every change became public drama. Each additional floor was treated like a move in chess. Architects, engineers, and developers were portrayed as generals fighting with steel instead of armies. Other players joined the madness. Metropolitan Life announced plans for a 100-story tower. Developers discussed 105 floors. Visionaries proposed 1,500-foot structures with rooftop airfields. The city seemed intoxicated by height. But beneath the spectacle, two men remained focused on each other. Severance accelerated construction downtown. He hired Paul Starrett, a builder famous for speed. 3 shifts worked around the clock, 7 days a week. Lights burned through the night. Steel climbed rapidly. From Wall Street, the tower rose like a spear. By mid-1929, it was visibly ahead. Van Allen felt the pressure. The Chrysler frame was complete, but its announced height lagged behind Severance's new revisions. When Severance added a pyramidal roof and steel cap, his building reached 927 feet. 2 feet taller than Chrysler's public figure. 2 feet. It was enough. In architectural terms, it was victory. Severance announced triumph. Ceremonies were planned. Invitations were sent. Press releases prepared. Downtown newspapers praised the world's tallest building. Uptown, Van Allen said nothing. Outwardly, he appeared defeated. Internally, he was waiting. Rumors began circulating. Construction workers whispered that something strange was happening inside the Chrysler building. Unusual deliveries, restricted areas, extra steel orders. Scaffolding around the crown seemed excessive. Severance heard the stories. He dismissed them. Every large project generated rumors. Every rival imagined secret tricks. He trusted his numbers. He trusted his foundations. He trusted that height was visible. And he was right, mostly. On November 13th, 1929-40, Wall Street officially topped out. Severance and Ostrom hosted a celebration. Executives, journalists, and investors gathered to mark the achievement. Photographs were taken. Speeches were made. The tallest building in the world, they declared. They were 3 weeks late. In late October, while downtown celebrated prematurely, something extraordinary had happened uptown. Inside the Chrysler building, workers opened the dome. From its core, hidden steel sections were raised and assembled. The spire emerged without warning. No announcement, no invitation, no warning shot. It simply appeared. By the time news reached Wall Street, it was finished. The Chrysler building now stood at 1,046 feet, 119 feet taller than Severance's tower. Not 2, 119. The psychological impact was devastating. Severance considered options. Could he add height? No. The foundations would not support it. Could he challenge the definition? He tried. His associates argued that the spire contained no usable floor space and therefore should not count. Articles were written. Technical debates were launched. No one cared. The public accepted the new record instantly. Height was height. A needle in the sky counted. The final score was permanent. Chrysler, 1,046 feet. 40 Wall Street, 927 feet. A partnership that had begun with shared success had ended in silent defeat. Van Allen compared the spire's emergence to a butterfly leaving its cocoon. Severance never used such metaphors again. The rivalry did not end with reconciliation. They never spoke again. Each man went on with his career. But history chose its winner. Not because Chrysler was taller forever. It wasn't. But because it had won when it mattered. In the defining moment of Manhattan's vertical age. And in doing so, it transformed a personal feud into one of the greatest architectural dramas in modern history. Before dawn, they were already climbing. While most of Manhattan still slept, construction workers gathered at the base of the Chrysler building in heavy coats and worn boots. They drank coffee from dented metal cups, adjusted gloves, and exchanged few words. There was no ceremony to the start of the day. Work began when the light was barely enough to see steel from sky. Temporary ladders bolted to columns carried them upward. 100 feet, 200, 500. By the time office clerks stepped out of Grand Central Terminal, hundreds of men were already balanced on beams far above them. To outsiders, the work looked reckless. Newsreels filmed riveters straddling narrow girders without visible harnesses. Ironworkers walked casually across open space, as if strolling a sidewalk. Plasterers leaned over edges with buckets, swinging in the wind. Audiences gasped. The footage became legendary. But what the cameras did not show was the invisible structure behind the spectacle. The Chrysler building was not chaos. It was choreography. Every crew knew where it belonged and when. Steelworkers advanced first, raising the frame. Riveters followed within hours. Concrete teams moved in behind them. Bricklayers sealed walls. Window installers followed. Electricians and plumbers threaded systems inside. No trade waited long. Idle time was treated as failure. The engineering firm coordinating operations turned the building into a vertical assembly line. Materials arrived precisely when needed. Hoists ran continuously. Cranes rarely stopped. If a beam was late, 5 teams were delayed. So beams were never late. Schedules were measured in minutes, not days. Walter Chrysler insisted on this discipline. From his decades in factories, he had learned that productivity was psychological as much as mechanical. Workers who waited lost focus. Crews that fell behind cut corners. Systems that drifted created accidents. So the system did not drift. Each morning, foremen received updated targets. Each evening, performance was reviewed, not to punish, but to correct. Chrysler believed mistakes were signals, not sins. He wanted them exposed early. Safety was embedded into this rhythm. Contrary to popular myth, workers were not abandoned to risk. Netting hung beneath platforms. Scaffolding had rails. Tarp-covered walkways caught falling tools. First aid stations operated on every major level. A full medical clinic functioned on site, staffed around the clock. In an era when injured workers were often dismissed without compensation, this was extraordinary. Chrysler demanded incident reports. He read them. He asked why. If a tool fell, procedures changed. If a worker slipped, surfaces were modified. If fatigue appeared, shifts were adjusted. He did not romanticize danger. He eliminated it when possible. The result was historic. Industry experts predicted dozens of fatalities. A common rule estimated 1 death per 15 stories. At 77 stories, more than 60 deaths were expected. There were none. Not one. It stunned the construction world. Unions cited the project as proof that high-rise work did not require sacrifice. Insurance companies revised their models. Developers quietly borrowed Chrysler's methods. For floors per week became possible because fear had been reduced. Men who trusted their environment worked faster. The numbers told the story. More than 20,000 tons of steel erected. Nearly 400,000 rivets driven. 4 million bricks laid. Thousands of windows installed. Each statistic represented thousands of coordinated actions. Inside the building, parallel progress continued. Elevator systems were tested, while floors above were still open to sky. Heating pipes rose as walls were sealed. Electrical wiring followed structural paths mapped months earlier. Nothing was improvised. Van Allen and his engineers maintained constant communication with site managers. Design adjustments were transmitted quickly. Structural calculations were updated in real time. The building behaved like a living organism, adapting, responding, growing. Workers sensed this. Many later recalled that the Chrysler job felt different, not easier, better organized. You knew where you stood. You knew what was expected. You knew the system would not abandon you. By late summer 1929, the tower was nearing its final form. From street level, it appeared almost complete. Brick walls enclosed most floors. Stainless steel panels shimmered near the crown. Windows reflected clouds. Scaffolding wrapped the upper levels like a cocoon. To casual observers, construction seemed to be winding down. In reality, it was shifting inward. Crews now worked downward from the top, finishing interior spaces while upper floors received final detailing. Plasterers smoothed walls. Carpenters installed trim. Painters followed. The building was being dressed. Meanwhile, hidden work continued. Inside the core, sections of steel were being moved quietly. Deliveries arrived without markings. Elevators transported materials to restricted levels. Most workers were unaware of their purpose. They followed instructions. That was enough. Van Allen had created layers of information. Only a handful of supervisors knew the whole picture. This compartmentalization was deliberate. Leaks would ruin the plan. By early autumn, newspapers announced that the Chrysler building would soon reach its maximum height. Reporters wrote that the race was nearly over. Downtown interest relaxed. Investors redirected attention. Competitors believed the outcome was settled. Uptown, Chrysler watched calmly. He trusted his system. The same logic that had allowed 4 floors per week would allow something unprecedented. Speed plus precision plus secrecy. A combination few rivals could match. In late September, final safety inspections were conducted on upper platforms. Cables were tested. Hoisting equipment was reinforced. Temporary supports were installed. To most workers, it looked like routine preparation. To Van Allen's inner circle, it was a last rehearsal. The building had risen like a factory in vertical motion. Now it was about to perform its most delicate operation, an act that would last barely 90 minutes, and change everything. For most of 1929, the Chrysler Building appeared to be telling a simple story. It was rising fast. It was beautifully designed. It would soon be finished. To journalists, investors, and rival architects, there was nothing mysterious about it. It was another ambitious skyscraper in an era obsessed with height. Its progress could be measured in floors and feet. Its future seemed predictable. But inside the building's core, another story was unfolding. It was invisible. At the center of the tower ran a vertical shaft, originally designated as a fire and utility corridor. In ordinary buildings, such shafts were narrow, functional, and unremarkable. They carried stairs, pipes, cables, and emergency access routes. In the Chrysler Building, this shaft was different. It was wider. It was reinforced. It was unusually empty. On blueprints, it looked ordinary enough. Few people examined it closely. Fewer still questioned why so much vertical space was being left unused. That space was Van Allen's hiding place. Months earlier, while the public focused on announced heights and visible progress, Van Allen had begun planning something radical. He understood the race into the sky better than anyone. Height records were fragile. Announcements were weapons. Public perception shaped investment and confidence. If he revealed his true design too early, rivals would respond. So he chose silence. Instead of competing openly, he would build privately. The idea was simple in concept and terrifying in execution. A steel spire, taller than any roof or cap competitors could add, assembled inside the building and raised at the last moment. Not hoisted from the street, not constructed on the roof. Hidden, like a blade inside a sheath. Engineers calculated possibilities. The spire would be 185 feet tall. It would weigh 27 tons. It would be made of lattice steel reinforced with diagonal struts. It had to be light enough to lift, strong enough to resist wind, and narrow enough to pass through the dome opening. Every variable mattered. Wind shear, cable tension, structural resonance, load distribution. One miscalculation could collapse the operation. Van Allen turned to his cousin, William Edwin Squire, a structural engineer. Together, they ran numbers again and again. They simulated forces. They examined failure scenarios. On paper, it worked. On paper. Reality was less forgiving. By mid-1929, steel orders were placed quietly. No press releases. No publicity. Components arrived at odd hours. They were unloaded discreetly and moved inside the building under supervision. They disappeared into freight elevators and emerged near the core. Workers assembling them were given limited information. They saw blueprints showing angles and connections. They did not see the full shape. They were building pieces of a puzzle without knowing the picture. Inside the shaft, scaffolding rose. Platforms were erected. Lighting was installed. Ventilation systems were added to remove heat from rivet work. The shaft became a hidden factory. Day after day, steel sections were bolted together in confined darkness. Rivets glowed red in spaces barely wide enough to swing a hammer. Sweat condensed on cold metal. The air smelled of oil and ozone. Only gradually did the structure take form. First, vertical columns, then diagonal braces, then tapering segments. Some workers began to suspect this was no stairwell. This was no utility system. This was something else. But they kept working. The project demanded discipline. Secrecy extended beyond the shaft. Scaffolding around the crown served two purposes. Officially, it allowed workers to finish stainless steel cladding. In reality, it hid the opening through which the spire would emerge. From the street, nothing looked unusual. From neighboring rooftops, nothing looked unusual. From rival offices, nothing looked unusual. Van Allen had created visual noise, ordinary construction activity, to mask extraordinary preparation. Rumors still spread. Workers downtown at 40, Wall Street heard whispers. Truck drivers talked. Material suppliers noticed unusual orders. Some claimed the Chrysler building was hiding something. Severance heard these stories. He dismissed them. Every major project generated myths. People always imagined secret tricks. He trusted visible facts. His building was taller. That was enough. By early October, the spire was complete. All 4 sections had been assembled inside the shaft. They stood stacked vertically, supported by temporary braces. They were waiting. Van Allen inspected them personally. He climbed into the shaft and examined joints, welds, rivets. He tested stability. He questioned engineers relentlessly. This was his career distilled into one gamble. If it failed, he would be remembered for disaster. If it succeeded, he would redefine skyscraper construction. He chose the timing carefully. Late October, before winter storms, before competitors could react, before public attention shifted. No press was informed. No photographers were invited. Even Chrysler was told little. He trusted Van Allen, but he did not micromanage the details. He understood that this phase belonged to engineers. Permits were filed quietly. Hoisting equipment was reinforced. Emergency plans were drafted. Workers practiced sequences. Which cable first? Which lock second? Which bolt third? There was no room for improvisation. The spire rested inside the building like a compressed spring. It represented months of hidden labor, hundreds of calculations, thousands of decisions, all aimed at one moment. On the morning chosen for the operation, the building looked unchanged. Traffic flowed. Street vendors worked. Office workers hurried past. No one knew that inside the tower, history was waiting to be lifted. Van Allen stood blocks away. He did not want to watch directly. He had done everything he could. Now the system would decide. Inside the shaft, crews took their positions. Cables tightened. Winches engaged. The secret weapon was about to leave its sheath. The morning was ordinary. That was what made it dangerous. There were no storms, no dramatic clouds, no warning signs. October's sunlight filtered between buildings and reflected off windows. Traffic moved along Lexington Avenue. Streetcars clattered. Vendors arranged newspapers and cigarettes. Nothing suggested that, less than 1,000 feet above, 27 tons of steel were about to be lifted through open space. Inside the Chrysler building, however, nothing was ordinary. Long before sunrise, engineers and foremen gathered on the upper floors. They reviewed procedures one last time. Checklists were read aloud. Cable tensions were tested. Winches were lubricated. Backup lines were attached. Every man knew his role. There would be no second chances. At the base of the shaft, workers removed temporary braces holding the lowest section of the spire. At the crown, crews adjusted guide rails and prepared the opening in the dome. Wind speed was measured repeatedly. It was within limits. Barely. William Van Allen did not stand on the roof. He could not. He positioned himself several blocks away, where he could see the upper silhouette of the building without hearing the machinery. From there, he watched through binoculars. He later admitted that he felt physically ill. Years of calculation and secrecy had led to this. Now it was out of his hands. At precisely the scheduled hour, the chief engineer gave the signal. Winches engaged. Steel cables tightened. The first section of the spire began to rise. Slowly, almost imperceptibly. At first, nothing seemed to move. Then workers noticed a slight shift. Shadows changed. The metal frame lifted free of its supports. 27 tons responded to human hands and gears. A murmur ran through the crews. No one celebrated. They focused. The section rose vertically inside the shaft, guided by rails and rollers. Workers on platforms leaned in, using ropes and poles to keep it centered. Any deviation could cause it to jam. If it jammed, no one knew how to fix it. If a cable snapped, the section would fall through 70 floors. No safety system could stop it. It would tear through concrete and steel like a missile. At street level, no one noticed. A few pedestrians glanced up, as they often did, admiring the tower. They saw scaffolding. They saw nothing else. When the first section reached the dome opening, crews at the crown took over. They guided it outward, swung it into position, and lowered it into its structural socket on the 66th floor. Bolts were inserted immediately. Temporary locks engaged. The section was secure. Only then did workers allow themselves a breath. The second section followed. This was more dangerous. Wind had increased slightly. The higher the steel rose, the more it caught invisible currents. It began to sway. Men on guide ropes leaned back with full body weight. Others adjusted winches by fractions of turns. The spire moved like a living thing. Up. Pause. Correct. Continue. Van Allen watched, barely blinking. His stomach tightened every time the steel shifted. Minutes stretched into hours. But they were not hours. They were minutes. The system was working. The second section settled into place. Riveters moved instantly, hammering glowing metal into joints. Sparks flew into open air. Hot fragments fell hundreds of feet and burned out before reaching the ground. Then the third section rose. Fatigue set in. Hands cramped. Voices grew hoarse. Concentration wavered. Foremen shouted reminders. Focus. Slow. Steady. This section was the longest. It took the most time. Wind gusts forced pauses. Once, the spire rotated slightly off-axis. For a few seconds, it hung at a dangerous angle. Several men froze. One misjudged pull could have tipped it, but experienced hands corrected the tension. The angle vanished. It straightened. Applause almost broke out. It didn't. They were not finished. The fourth and final section was the cap. The narrow tip. The symbol. By now, nearly an hour had passed. Everyone knew that success was close. That knowledge was a threat. Complacency kills. Supervisors barked orders more sharply. Final checks were repeated. When the last section rose, the entire spire was visible above the dome. From Van Allen's position, it looked unreal, like a pencil balance on air. Workers locked into place. Rivets were driven. Braces were tightened. Connections were inspected. One by one, temporary supports were removed. The spire stood on its own. At that moment, the Chrysler building reached 1,046 feet. No horn sounded. No banner dropped. No crowd cheered. Inside the building, men leaned against railings, breathing hard. Some laughed quietly. Others sat down where they stood. Several removed their helmets and wiped sweat from their faces. Van Allen lowered his binoculars. For the first time in weeks, he exhaled fully. The operation had taken less than 90 minutes, a feat that had required months of secrecy, years of preparation, and decades of experience. Still, no one announced it. Scaffolding remained. The crown stayed hidden. From the street, the difference was subtle. Only careful observers noticed a new shape beneath the coverings. Downtown, Severance's team did not learn immediately. News traveled slowly. When it reached them, it felt unreal. By the time they confirmed it, the spire was immovable, bolted, integrated, permanent. The victory could not be undone. Days later, newspapers finally reported the truth. Headlines recalculated heights. Charts were revised. Records were rewritten. The Chrysler building was the tallest structure in the world, and it had happened almost in secret. No ceremony, no warning, just 90 minutes of perfect execution. The next morning, the stock market began to collapse. The age of limitless optimism was ending. But above Lexington Avenue, a steel needle now marked the peak of American ambition. When the scaffolding finally began to come down in the spring of 1930, New York paused. It did not pause formally. There was no official announcement that citizens should look up. No holiday. No parade. The city simply noticed, almost at once, that something extraordinary had emerged from behind canvas and steel poles. The Chrysler building revealed itself, and it was unlike anything that had ever stood on Manhattan soil. From the street, the crown appeared first. 7 great arches, layered one behind another, rose toward the spire. Each terrace stepped back with mathematical precision, creating a sense of motion frozen in metal. Triangular windows pierced the surface in repeating patterns, catching sunlight and scattering it like shards of glass. The building did not end. It accelerated. Where older skyscrapers stopped abruptly, flat roofs, blunt edges, decorative cornices, this one seemed to dissolve into the sky. Its lines narrowed, sharpened, and stretched upward, guiding the eye to the needle at the summit. William Van Allen had designed it that way deliberately. He wanted the building to look as though it were climbing, even when standing still. The material made the illusion complete. The crown was covered in a new stainless steel alloy containing chromium and nickel, imported from Germany. Unlike copper or bronze, it did not darken with age. It resisted corrosion. Rain washed it clean. In sunlight, it glowed. In cloud cover, it shimmered. At night, it reflected the city's lights like polished glass. For the first time, a skyscraper behaved like a mirror of modernity. It was not stone pretending to be eternal. It was metal celebrating speed. Automobile imagery reinforced the message. On the 61st floor, massive stainless steel eagles crouched at the corners, their wings streamlined, their beaks pointed forward. They were enlarged versions of Chrysler hood ornaments, transformed into guardians of the skyline. 10 floors lower, replicas of radiator caps projected from the facade. Even the setbacks echoed mechanical forms. The building was a vertical extension of the factory, a monument to industry, a declaration that machines were not ugly necessities, but sources of beauty. Architectural critics struggled to categorize it. Some praised its originality. Others called it excessive. Traditionalists dismissed it as theatrical. Modernists admired its daring. But no one ignored it. From Brooklyn, Queens, and New Jersey, the spire was visible. Taxi drivers used it as a landmark. Tourists searched for it instinctively. Artists painted it. Photographers framed it. It became part of the city's identity almost overnight. Below the crown, the facade gave way to quieter dignity. Brick walls, steel-framed windows, and rhythmic setbacks created order beneath the exuberance above. The transition was intentional. Van Allen believed that drama should rise gradually, not explode at street level. Chrysler agreed. The building was meant to reward attention, not overwhelm it. Inside, the experience continued. Visitors entering from Lexington Avenue stepped into a lobby that rejected minimalism completely. Red Moroccan marble covered the walls, deep and luminous. Amber onyx panels flanked elevator banks, glowing softly under hidden lighting. Bronze frames, polished granite floors, and geometric patterns reflected the aesthetics of speed and precision. Above, Edward Trumbull's mural stretched across the ceiling. It depicted airplanes banking through clouds, ships cutting oceans, factories humming with energy, and assembly lines producing automobiles. At the center, the Chrysler building itself appeared, rising from the machinery of civilization. It was a building celebrating its own existence. Some critics found this self-referential. Chrysler found it honest. He had never pretended that the tower was altruistic. It was his monument. The elevators were artworks in themselves. No two interiors were identical. Wood veneers from multiple continents were combined in abstract patterns. Brass inlays formed lotus shapes and sunbursts. Lighting fixtures echoed Art Deco motifs. Riding an elevator felt like entering a private gallery. Higher up, offices filled quickly. Despite the approaching economic uncertainty, businesses were eager to occupy the world's tallest building. The address alone carried prestige. Companies used it on letterheads and advertisements. Chrysler Building became shorthand for success. At 66 floors, the Cloud Club opened. It was not accessible to the public. It was exclusive. Membership was limited to wealthy executives, financiers, and industrial leaders. The rooms mixed old-world luxury with futuristic design. Oak-paneled lounges, marble staircases, cloud-painted ceilings. Here, deals were made. Stock prices were discussed between courses. Cigars burned beneath murals of refineries and ports. Waiters moved silently. Private lockers stored liquor during Prohibition. From its windows, members looked down on the city like strategists surveying territory. Walter Chrysler maintained a private suite. It was understated compared to the lobby. Dark wood, etched glass, automobile-themed friezes. From his windows, he could see Central Park and the East River. He liked the height, not for vanity, for perspective. He once joked that he had built the highest bathroom in Manhattan, so he could look down on Henry Ford. The remark was half humor, half truth. Rivalries never fully disappeared. But now, Chrysler had something no competitor could take, a permanent marker on the skyline. International visitors took notice. European architects studied its form. Critics debated its symbolism. One famous visitor described it as jazz and steel, improvised, rhythmic, exuberant. The phrase stuck. It captured something essential. This was not a building designed by committee. It was not cautious. It was confident to the point of audacity. Some called it vulgar. Others called it brilliant. Both were partly right. By the end of 1930, the Chrysler Building was complete, not just structurally. Culturally, it had entered collective memory. At a time when economic clouds gathered and optimism began to fracture, the tower stood as a last, glittering expression of unrestrained American ambition, a spike of chrome and steel driven into the sky, a reminder of what was possible when wealth, engineering, and obsession aligned. And for Walter Chrysler, it was proof that a boy from the prairie had written his name across the heavens. If the Chrysler Building announced its ambition from miles away, it confirmed that ambition the moment a visitor crossed its threshold. Most skyscrapers of the era treated their lobbies as transitional spaces, places to move through quickly on the way to offices above. Marble might decorate the walls and brass might frame the doors, but the purpose was practical. The Chrysler Building rejected that logic. Here, the lobby was not a corridor. It was a statement. Visitors entering from Lexington Avenue stepped into a space designed to slow them down. The ceiling soared overhead, its proportions carefully calculated to create awe without intimidation. Walls were clad in deep red Moroccan marble, streaked with white veins that caught and reflected light. Amber onyx panels glowed softly beside elevator banks, illuminated from behind like translucent stone lanterns. Bronze-framed windows filtered daylight into geometric patterns. Polished granite floors mirrored everything above them. Nothing was accidental. Every surface had been chosen to communicate permanence, precision, and wealth. William Van Allen wanted visitors to feel immediately that they had entered a different category of building. Walter Chrysler agreed. He believed that environments shape behavior. If people felt they were in an exceptional place, they would act accordingly. Tenants would respect it. Investors would value it. Employees would feel pride. Above the lobby, Edward Trumbull's mural stretched across nearly 8,000 square feet of ceiling. It was among the largest murals in the world. It depicted modern civilization as Chrysler understood it. Airplanes banking through stylized clouds, ocean liners crossing abstract seas, factory lines humming with synchronized motion, and workers tending powerful machines. At the center, rising from this network of movement and labor, stood the Chrysler Building itself. The tower celebrated its own role in progress. Some critics found this self-glorifying. Chrysler found it truthful. His fortune had come from industry. His building honored industry. The elevator banks beneath the mural formed the building's arteries. 32 elevators served the tower, divided into zones to minimize waiting times. Engineers optimized routes so that no passenger would waste minutes traveling unnecessary distances. Speed mattered. Time was currency. But even inside these machines, artistry ruled. Elevator doors were inlaid with rare woods, Japanese ash, English hairwood, walnut maple, arranged in lotus and sunburst patterns. Brass fittings gleamed. Each cab interior was unique. No two journeys were identical. Riding upward felt ceremonial. As elevators climbed, city noise faded. Street sounds dissolved into a distant hum. Passengers emerged onto office floors where light poured through large windows, offering views that few buildings could match. Tenants quickly recognized the advantage. Leasing space in the Chrysler Building meant more than an address. It meant prestige. Companies printed the name on stationery, advertisements, and signage. Offices in the world's tallest building became a marketing tool. Law firms, engineering companies, and trading houses filled the floors. Despite early signs of economic instability, occupancy remained high in the first years. Businesses believed height equals security. A tower that dominated the skyline seemed immune to collapse. At the 66th floor, another world existed, the Cloud Club. It was accessible only by invitation. 300 members, drawn from the city's financial, industrial, and political elite, formed its core. Oil executives, bankers, publishers, and corporate strategists met here daily. The club was created partly to satisfy major tenant Texaco, which demanded high-end facilities for executives. Chrysler went far beyond the request. He built a private realm in the clouds. The 66th floor featured Tudor-style lounges with dark oak paneling, leather chairs, and wrought iron chandeliers. It evoked English gentlemen's clubs, projecting stability and tradition. Above it, on the 67th floor, the aesthetic shifted completely. Here, Van Allen embraced futurism. Polished granite columns supported vaulted ceilings painted with drifting clouds. Etched glass sconces glowed softly. A panoramic mural of Manhattan covered one wall, transforming the city into art. The contrast was intentional. Tradition below, modernity above. The club embodied both. Members dined on multi-course meals served on fine china. They discussed mergers, oil contracts, shipping routes, and market rumors. Stock tickers relayed prices in real time. Private lockers stored liquor during Prohibition. A barber shop allowed executives to groom themselves between meetings. It was not a place for leisure. It was a place for power. Deals finalized here shaped industries. Walter Chrysler maintained his own suite nearby. It was quieter than the club, more restrained. Dark wood, etched glass panels, and automobile-themed friezes lined the walls. From his windows, Central Park and the East River stretched outward. He sometimes worked there, sometimes simply sat and watched. Height offered detachment. From this level, traffic looked abstract. People became dots. Noise vanished. It reminded him that systems, when viewed from above, revealed their patterns. The Cloud Club operated only during daylight hours. Members came for lunch, conducted business, then descended back into the city. It was not a nightclub. It was not social theater. It was an office disguised as luxury. For nearly 50 years, it remained one of New York's most exclusive spaces. Few outsiders ever entered. Few records were kept. Its influence was invisible. Meanwhile, the building below continued its daily rhythm. Thousands entered each morning. Thousands left each evening. Elevators rose and fell like pistons. Lights switched on and off in patterns that resembled electronic circuits. The Chrysler Building became a vertical city, self-contained, efficient, symbolic. It was no longer merely a structure. It was an ecosystem, a place where architecture, commerce, and ambition converged. From marble lobby to cloud-level dining room, the building translated Walter Chrysler's worldview into space. Order, precision, pride, and belief in systems that reached higher than any individual. For a time, it seemed that this world above the streets might last forever.